This is a situation currently unfolding in my life. It has been persisting for nearly 3 weeks now. I recently decided to create a profile on the dating website Plenty of Fish. I had been single for 8 months and knew several friends who had found success on the platform. I figured there was no harm in trying it out for myself. About a month after I signed up, I received a message from a very attractive girl. We seemed to get along quite well and maintained a conversation for a few weeks. We eventually decided to exchange our Kik usernames. That was the moment everything took a turn for the worse. Within the span of only 4 messages, she admitted that her profile pictures were fake. She proceeded to send me new ones, promising me that she was being honest this time, and swearing that she was real. However, the girl in the new photos looked too good to be true, being a frequent viewer of the show Catfish. I decided to perform a reverse image search. My suspicions were confirmed when I found the identity of the real girl in the photos. When I confronted her with my findings, she sent another set of images. Once again, a quick search proved they were not her. At this point, I became completely fed up with the deception. I told her firmly to never contact me again. My rejection caused her to become extremely angry. She began hurling every possible insult at me, claiming that she was a stripper. She claimed she could have provided me with any pleasure I desired, and insisted that I was the one missing out. Shortly after, I started receiving messages from various new accounts. These accounts on Plenty of Fish and Kik all claimed to be her friends or colleagues. However, they all utilized the exact same typing style she did. Deep down, I knew with certainty that they were all just her using different aliases. I finally decided I had dealt with enough of her behavior. I signed out of Kik on my mobile device, deleted the application entirely, and attempted to move on with my day. However, my phone soon began buzzing with standard text messages. She had somehow obtained my personal number. She started sending a barrage of messages, claiming she was sorry, professing her love for me, and stating she desperately wanted me back. Eventually, a final message appeared that contained nothing but a web link. I examined the URL and noticed it ended with the phrase, "I love you." I chose not to open it. Feeling physically sick to my stomach from the stress, I tried to have dinner, but I could not bring myself to actually cook anything. Instead, I simply sat at my desk in the dark with a burger and a Coke. I switched on my laptop, hoping to find a good show to watch as a distraction. However, I felt so mentally drained that I ended up mindlessly scrolling through reels on YouTube. Suddenly, without any input from me, a new browser tab jerked open. The same link from the text message, the one ending in "I love you," loaded itself onto my screen. The entire window theme instantly shifted into a deep, unnatural shade of black. My heart skipped a beat as a pop-up window appeared. It was a live feed of my own face, captured from my webcam. Another pop-up window appeared right next to it. In that frame, I could see the dim silhouette of a woman sitting in a pitch-black room, silently watching me through the screen. I panicked and immediately tried to shut the laptop down, but the entire system had been locked. Even the physical power button on the hardware would not respond to my touch. I looked at the icons on my desktop with horror. Every one of my files, including my office work, my personal photos, and my private documents, was now hidden behind an encryption shield. A message flashed across the center of my screen. It informed me that my system was locked. It stated that to regain access to my work and personal files, I was required to share my bank details with the lady in the shadow. It further noted that a fee of $500 would be charged. It was in that moment that I realized this was not a simple case of catfishing. It was a targeted scam, originating from the dark web. I did not stick around to see what the silhouette would do next. I reached behind my desk and ripped the power cord for the Wi-Fi router out of the wall. Then, I flipped the laptop over and tore the battery straight out of the casing. The screen finally went dead. Thankfully, I had been cautious enough to keep a backup of almost all my important data on a separate portable hard drive. This device was not plugged into the computer at the time. I took the laptop to a professional service center the following morning. The technicians informed me that the entire operating system had been compromised and that they would have to reinstall Windows from scratch. They also issued a stern warning for me to change my network immediately, as my personal information was likely now floating around on a dark web hit list. I ended up losing my personal settings and quite a few nights of sleep, but I am proud to say I did not give that shadow a single cent of my money. The fluorescent lights of the office had been buzzing in my ears for 12 hours. My boss had been clear. The deadline was tomorrow, and being the new guy at 22, I wasn't about to be the one who failed. By the time I sprinted for the last bus, my off-green button-down was damp with sweat, and my tie was hanging loosely around my neck. I managed to collapse into a seat just as the doors hissed shut. The ride was a 75-minute blur of city lights and exhaustion. When the bus finally spat me out at my stop, I still had a 10-minute walk ahead of me. It was 9:20 p.m. In this neighborhood that wasn't late, but the streets were unnervingly empty. The silence felt heavy. The streetlights here are a joke. They're spaced so far apart that the sidewalk is a sequence of bright circles followed by long stretches of ink-black shadows. I hiked my laptop bag higher on my shoulder and quickened my pace. I was approaching the old abandoned hospital. I usually didn't mind it. I'd started hitting the gym recently and felt capable, even confident. Then I heard it. A sharp metallic strike against stone. I slowed down. Sitting on a large rock near the hospital's perimeter was a man. He looked like a ghost skeletal, skin stretched so tight over his ribs you could count them through his tattered open shirt. He hit the stone again. This time I saw the glint. It was a 9-inch blade, shimmering under the distant yellow glow of a street lamp. He muttered something, a guttural, unintelligible scream. Then, he began to tap the flat of the blade against his palm. The sound was a wet thud that echoed off the hospital walls. I tried to stay calm, but his head tilted to the side as he watched me. He looked like he was hunting. I gripped my bag tighter, wondering if I could use it to protect myself. My heart was beating so fast I could feel it in my throat. I kept my eyes forward and kept walking. I tried to look strong, even though I was terrified. Every step felt heavy. I was almost past him and back into the dark part of the street when I heard his feet move on the gravel. He didn't move slowly. He jumped toward me. Suddenly, the distance between us evaporated. He was fast. Before I could breathe, he was standing right in front of me. He smelled like old sweat and copper. It was a thick, gross smell that made me want to gag. He stepped into my path, his eyes wide and glazed with a drug-induced film. His pupils were huge and gray. He reached out and grabbed my hand, holding me in place. His grip was very strong. His skin felt cold and dry, like old leather. But he didn't point the blade at me. Instead, he turned the knife toward his own chest. He leaned in until his face was only inches from mine. I could see the cracks on his lips and his yellow teeth. He didn't blink once. He looked very calm as he pushed the sharp edge of the knife into his own skin. He began to cut himself slowly. The blade went through his skin easily, like it was cutting through paper. I heard a quiet, wet sound as the skin opened up. I stood frozen and watched the blood start to cover his chest. The first few drops were dark, but then they turned bright red. He didn't seem to feel any pain. He didn't even make a sound. Actually, he looked more relaxed as he did it. He used the tip of the knife to draw a bloody line across his collarbone. The sight was traumatizing. I wanted to run or scream, but I couldn't move. A drop of his blood landed on my shirt sleeve. It felt warm on my arm. As the blood became more visible, his smile only grew wider, stretching across his face in a way that didn't feel human. His smile was so wide it looked like his skin might rip. He leaned his forehead against mine and forced me to look down at his bloody chest. He wasn't trying to rob me. He was showing me something horrific. "Do you see?" he whispered. His voice was rough and dry. "Do you see how easy it is?" He started to laugh. It was a low, bubbling sound. Blood was everywhere now. It soaked into his pants and dripped onto the ground between us. He started to sway back and forth, pulling me with him because he still had hold of my hand. He kept moving the knife, making small, quick cuts over his ribs. He finally released my hand, and the sheer shock of what I had just witnessed made my knees buckle. I fell onto the street in total terror. The ground was cold and dirty under my hands. He didn't move toward me. He simply started that same rhythmic tapping again, hitting the now blood-stained knife against his hand while staring into my soul. The sound of the metal hitting his bloody palm was the only thing I could hear. He looked happy, like he had just shown me something important. I looked at the knife, and then at his face. I realized the knife wasn't meant for me. It was for him. He just wanted me to watch his nightmare. He kept staring at me, and I saw spit dripping from the corner of his mouth. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I threw my wallet toward him, though I don't think he even wanted it. It landed near his feet, but he didn't look at it. I scrambled to my feet, tripping over my feet once before I got steady. I ran. I didn't stop until I was through my front door, fumbling with the deadbolt. I leaned against the door and tried to breathe. My lungs felt like they were on fire. I looked down and saw the red blood stain on my sleeve. I took the shirt off immediately and threw it in the trash. I didn't want it near me. I never made a complaint to the police. I know who those people are, and they know me. Making a scene would only make it worse. In this part of town, the police can't really help with people like him. I'm already looking for a new place to rent. But for now, I make sure my work is done long before the deadline hits. I don't walk those streets in the dark anymore. Now, every time I hear metal hitting something like a spoon on a plate, I feel his cold hand on my wrist again. I can still see his dark eyes watching me from the shadows. There is a quiet, hidden lake a short walk from my house in East Texas. I've been going there to fish for a long time. It is tucked away from the roads and houses, which gives it perfect privacy. Usually, I am the only person out there on the water. Because the walk is a bit long, I leave my canoe in the same spot by the lake whenever I am not using it. It is much easier than carrying the heavy thing back and forth from the house. I keep it leaning against a large oak tree and keep it covered so that snakes or other animals do not hide inside. One warm summer evening, I was out on the water with my younger brother, MJ. He is only in the 4th grade, and since our parents were out for the evening, I was responsible for watching him. We had been out for about an hour and had caught a few catfish. As the sun began to set and the light disappeared behind the pine trees, I heard a loud splashing sound from the edge of the lake. I turned the boat and saw a man standing at the water's edge. He was tipping a large barrel over and pouring a dark liquid into the lake. It looked like he was polluting the water. I felt I had to do something, so I shouted out to ask him what he was doing. The man looked up at me in surprise and immediately ran into the woods, even though the barrel was still pouring. I looked closer at the liquid and noticed it was a very dark red color. Even though it was getting dark, the sight made me feel very uneasy. I decided we needed to leave right away. I care a lot about nature, and seeing someone dump waste like that made me sick, but I no longer felt safe at the lake. I planned on reporting the man to the authorities. I paddled back to our usual spot and unloaded our gear. As I was covering the canoe, I heard the distinct sound of a branch snapping nearby. I wanted to call out, but I decided it was better to stay quiet. I finished my work faster than ever before. I did not even bother to lean the canoe against the tree. I just left it on the grass. I grabbed our cooler and gear and MJ and I walked quickly. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire time because I felt like someone was following us through the trees. Once we got home, I locked the door immediately. I was truly spooked. I put the fish in the fridge and started heating up some food for my brother. While the microwave was running, there was a sudden knock at the front door. The fear I felt in the woods came back instantly. I was certain I had been followed. My lights were on and my car was in the driveway, so whoever was outside knew we were home. A moment later, the person moved and knocked on the window. A man's voice came through the glass, telling me that he had seen me at the lake and wanted to explain himself. I had no intention of opening the door. The fact that he had tracked me to my house made him seem very dangerous. When he became more aggressive and kept yelling for me to answer, I finally shouted through the wall. I told him to leave immediately or I would call the police. The man tried to remain calm and asked me again to just open the front door so he could talk. I repeated my threat to call the cops, and then the house went silent. I went around and locked every single window. I called the police to report the dumping at the lake and the man at my door. Making those reports helped me feel a little better, but I remained very alert. Around 2 a.m., a loud crash from the den woke me up. I realized someone had broken in. I grabbed a heavy baseball bat and told MJ to stay hidden. I heard quiet footsteps coming up the stairs. I stood by the bedroom door with the bat ready. I watched the doorknob slowly turn and the door push open. The silhouette of a man entered the room. I quickly turned on the lamp and yelled for him to get out. I showed him I was armed and ready to defend us. The man had a small blade in his hand, but when he saw I wasn't backing down, he told me he was leaving. He turned and ran back downstairs. I chased him as far as the landing and watched him flee through the front door. I checked on MJ and then called the emergency line. My living room window was completely shattered with glass all over the carpet. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, holding my bat and watching that broken window. At 7 a.m., my parents finally returned home. I explained everything that had happened while they were away. My father went straight to work. He measured the frame and fixed the window. I later went back to the lake with the police to show them where the man had been. However, the barrel was gone. The man must have come back to move it before morning. I believe that barrel held something much worse than chemicals. I think it was something he was willing to kill for. I am just glad I kept the door locked and my brother safe. A week later, I still felt uneasy, so I went back to the oak tree to get my canoe. The grass underneath it was flat and dying. When I flipped the boat over, I froze in fear. Someone had carved a message into the wood with a knife. "I know where you sleep." Next to the words was a rusty fishing lure I had never seen before. That's when it hit me. He hadn't just followed me once. He was still out there watching and waiting for me to be alone in the woods again.
My name is Ayla. I am 33 years old now, but from the age of 19 until I turned 23, my life was defined by an addiction to heroin. The story of how I first started using is a long one, but there is a different story that carries more weight for me. It is the story of how I finally got clean. Calling it a better story is a stretch, because the reality of it is horrifying. However, it provided the brutal wake-up call I needed to save my own life. So I suppose there is a silver lining buried somewhere in the tragedy. About 18 months into my addiction, the thin stability I had left completely vanished. I was kicked out of my apartment, and my family, understandably exhausted by my choices, cut ties with me. I found myself living on the streets. At 21 years old, standing only 5 feet 2 inches tall, and weighing barely over 100 pounds, I was incredibly vulnerable. Looking back, I realize I should have been terrified, but at the time, my mind was entirely consumed by the constant need to find my next fix. Even so, the reality of being a young woman without a home is a nightmare I wouldn't wish on anyone. The first lesson you learn in that environment is the necessity of protection. It is a hard truth to admit, but survival often depends on having someone by your side. I was more fortunate than most. While many women are forced into dangerous situations for safety, I connected with a man who was also an addict and had been using for about as long as I had. He was only a few years older than me, and our bond wasn't just about the logistics of scoring drugs. We truly liked one another. Over time, that connection grew into a deep, genuine love. We spent 2 years navigating the world together. We faced the constant cycle of trying to quit, failing, and enduring the daily hardships of the lifestyle. The most important part of that time was the word together. He was my entire world, and I was his. He would do anything to keep me safe, from stealing to protect our interests, to physically defending me when things turned ugly. When we were eventually arrested for shoplifting and sentenced to 3 months in county jail, the separation was agonizing. I missed him more than I had ever missed my own family. I struggled to get by while he was locked away, so when the day of his release finally arrived, I was overwhelmed with relief. I actually cried with joy when I saw him again. While he was in jail, the system had forced him to get clean, but the moment he hit the pavement, his first instinct was to get high. I had anticipated this and prepared a small homecoming gift, a $10 bag of heroin. We quickly scouted out a quiet, secluded spot where we wouldn't be disturbed, eager to finally relax and be in each other's company again. He took his hit first, and then I used the rest of the supply. Afterward, we settled into each other's arms to sleep. It was a moment of closeness I had craved for months, a feeling of safety that is hard to put into words. As I drifted off, I felt him start to pull away slightly. I assumed he just needed to get up for a moment to use the bathroom. In my drug-induced haze and my desperation to keep him close, I reached out and tugged on his sleeve. I didn't want him to leave the embrace. I felt like I had waited an eternity for that cuddle, and I told myself he could surely wait just 1 more minute. When I finally opened my eyes again, I could still feel his arm draped around me. Coming down from a high makes the world feel sluggish and confusing, like your brain is struggling to log back into reality. For a brief second, I felt a wave of warmth and comfort. I wiggled closer to him, pulling his arm tighter against my body. I reached down to find his hand, intending to lace my fingers through his the way he always liked. That was when the warmth vanished. His hand wasn't just cold from the autumn Chicago air. It was a deep, heavy, stone-cold chill that bypassed the skin and went straight to my bones. It was the kind of cold that immediately signals that something is fundamentally wrong. I scrambled out from under him and spun around, frantically trying to shake him awake. When he didn't move, I let out a scream so violent that I physically became ill. The noise drew someone nearby to check on us, and the rest of the afternoon became a blurred montage of sirens, EMTs, and police officers asking endless questions. It was an overdose. After being clean for months in jail, his tolerance had dropped significantly. His body simply couldn't handle the dose. The realization that haunted me most was the memory of him pulling away. He hadn't been trying to go to the bathroom. He had been struggling to get help as his body began to shut down. While he was slipping into unconsciousness and passing away, I had been holding him tight, forcing him to stay still so I could enjoy the moment. I had slept next to his body for 5 or 6 hours. That image is something I carry with me every single day. Now, whenever I think about my recovery and how grateful I am to be sober, that memory is the very first thing that comes to mind. It serves as a permanent anchor to my past. I still find it impossible to say or type his name. Doing so triggers a level of grief that feels like it might tear me apart. Even though we were living a life of addiction, my love for him was the most real thing I had. I am plagued by the feeling that I am responsible for his death. He was clean when he walked out of those jail doors, and I was the one who handed him the very thing that killed him. It is a weight I carry constantly, a guilt that I suspect I will never truly be able to leave behind.
A few months ago, I decided that I was finally ready to move on from the breakup I had experienced during the previous summer. My relationship with my long-term girlfriend had ended, and it had taken me a significant amount of time to process the heartbreak. However, there eventually comes a point where a person simply has to get back out there and try again. I made the decision to download the dating app Hinge and began the process of looking through various profiles. In my experience, it felt like the most effective app available because it allowed for direct messaging. This feature meant I didn't have to sit around hoping for a mutual match before starting a conversation. It gave me a much better opportunity to talk to the specific kind of women I found attractive. One of those women was a Persian girl named Sarosh. Saroshi was truly one of the most beautiful people I had ever seen. She had a striking mane of dark, wild hair that was dyed blonde at the tips. Her features were very defined, with high cheekbones and perfectly shaped eyebrows. Her eyes were perhaps her most captivating feature, being a deep, dark brown that seemed very alluring. She was absolutely stunning. I felt like I had a bit of a competitive advantage because she had grown up in Tehran, the capital of Iran, and I happened to speak a small amount of Farsi. I thought that mentioning my knowledge of her native language might impress her, and it turned out that I was right. Within about an hour of sending my opening message, we were having a great conversation. She seemed to be an incredibly busy individual, so I felt quite flattered when she told me she would clear some time in her schedule to meet me. We eventually made arrangements to get coffee over the upcoming weekend. When the day of the date arrived, she showed up wearing her gym clothes. She was very quick to apologize for her casual appearance, explaining that she had just finished a session with her personal trainer and didn't have time to change. Her outfit didn't bother me in the least. She looked incredible in her yoga pants. We sat down with our coffees and began the typical first date ritual of discussing our lives, our jobs, and our various interests. While we were talking, I happened to look out of the large glass windows of the cafe. I noticed a man leaning against a car outside. At first, I assumed my mind was just playing tricks on me or that I was being paranoid, but after watching him for a minute or two, I realized he was staring directly at us without blinking. Saroshi eventually noticed that my attention was drifting over her shoulder. She asked me what I was looking at, and I mentioned the man outside who seemed to be staring us down quite intensely. She turned around to see for herself, but she spun back toward me almost instantly. The look on her face was one of pure terror. She urgently told me that we needed to leave the shop right that second. I asked her why and if she knew the man, but she denied knowing who he was. Despite her denial, I wasn't naive. I understood the situation immediately. It was obvious that this was either a very controlling family member or a dangerous ex-boyfriend. I initially assumed that the man would just follow us for a bit to try and act intimidating, but I never could have imagined that he would actually get physical with me. The way he eventually attacked me was terrifying. The city where I live is built up along a very wide river, and the coffee shop we had chosen was located right on the docks. As we started walking along the city's promenade, the man suddenly cornered me. He grabbed me tightly by the throat and began shoving me backward with a lot of force. Before I knew it, my back was pressed against the railings of the walkway, and I was leaning out over the water. I tried my best to pry his hands off of me, but the man was incredibly large and strong. No matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't break his grip. The river in my city is notorious for having an extremely powerful current. It is common knowledge that if someone falls into the water from a boat or the side of the promenade, they are in grave danger. The current is strong enough to pull a person under, drown them, and sweep them out into the Irish Sea in a very short amount of time. While he held me there, he began shouting threats at me. He told me in a very aggressive, macho way that I needed to leave Saroshi alone and stay away from her. During the struggle, Saroshi was hitting him on the head and screaming at him to let me go. All I could think about in that moment was that if I went over those railings and into the water, I was a dead man. I honestly don't think the man realized how dangerous the river was. Based on his voice, he didn't have the local accent, so he wasn't from our city. He probably thought he could just toss me into the water to embarrass me or scare me off, assuming I would be able to swim to safety. I knew for a fact that wouldn't have been the case. If he had pushed me, he would have ended up facing a manslaughter charge. Fortunately, he didn't follow through with throwing me over. After he had yelled and vented some of his anger, he finally let go of my throat. He backed away from us and started walking back in the direction he had originally come from. I can acknowledge that Saroshi was a gorgeous woman, and I can understand why a guy might feel bitter or jealous after a breakup. However, the level of aggression he showed was insane. If he had been just a little bit angrier or if he had completely lost his temper, I wouldn't be around to tell this story. I would likely be floating somewhere in the middle of the Irish Sea, or perhaps washing up on a beach in County Cork as a corpse. It is a frightening thought to realize my life was nearly ended just because someone couldn't handle their jealousy.
The separation of my parents occurred before I was born, which meant my childhood was split between two different homes. Every summer until I reached 19, I traveled to rural Missouri to stay with my father. He had been raised in that same countryside, and the majority of his relatives still lived in a small community. Since there were no movie theaters or typical city entertainment, I spent most of those long, humid days following my older cousin around. We were constantly looking for ways to get into mischief or exploring the dense woods that surrounded my father's property. During one of our usual treks through the wilderness, we stumbled upon a massive lake hidden deep in the middle of nowhere. It sat there quietly, undisturbed by the outside world. The water was remarkably clear, and as we looked closer, we could see an incredible number of huge fish swimming just beneath the surface. When we returned home and asked the adults about the spot, none of them seemed to know it existed. We figured that was why the fish had grown to such monstrous sizes. No one in the area was fishing there. Anyone who had found it in the past must have kept the location a secret or simply forgotten it. We returned to that hidden pond 3 or 4 times after that, and every single trip resulted in a stringer heavy with large fish. On our 5th visit, we had a specific goal in mind. The summer was drawing to a close, and we wanted to gather enough fish for a large family fry to celebrate the end of the season. We set out on a warm Saturday morning, leaving about an hour before the sun came up. The hike into the woods took over an hour, and we knew the fish would stop biting once the afternoon heat set in. Our plan was to finish early and make it back to my father's house by the start of the afternoon. The sight of the pond at dawn was beautiful. As soon as we cast our lines, the fish started biting almost immediately. For the next few hours, it was constant action, with one fish after another being pulled from the clear water. By late morning, around 10:45, we had reached our limit. I was anxious to start the long walk back. We were carrying 2 5-gallon buckets filled to the brim with our catch, and I knew the 90-minute trek would be even slower with the extra weight. However, my cousin had other ideas. He decided he wanted to take a swim in the lake before we left. He tried to convince me to jump in with him, but I didn't know how to swim at the time. Despite my desire to leave, he was older and in charge, so I had no choice but to wait. I sat down on a large rock and watched as he prepared for his swim. There was an old, weathered rope tied to a tree limb hanging over the water, looking as though it had been there for a century. My cousin decided he wanted to use it as a swing. I told him it looked dangerous and expressed my concerns, but he just laughed at me. He stripped down to his boxers, left his clothes in a pile next to me, and climbed up into the tree. After grabbing the rope, he pushed off and swung out over the lake. The rope snapped right above him before he reached the peak of his swing. He hit the deep water with a heavy, dull thud. At first, I prepared myself to laugh and tease him about the rope breaking, but as the seconds ticked by, he did not come back to the surface. The silence became terrifying. I scanned the water, hoping to see him pop up further away or perhaps floating if the impact had knocked him out. But there was nothing. Panic began to set in. I waded into the water as far as I felt safe, desperately searching the depths. However, every step I took stirred up the silt, making the water cloudy and impossible to see through. It eventually became clear that he had drowned. I felt completely helpless, wondering if I could have saved him if only I knew how to swim. With nothing else I could do, I packed up our gear and began the walk home alone. The walk back was agonizing. A tiny part of me hoped that this was all a cruel joke, and that he would jump out from behind a tree to surprise me. That moment never came. The weight of the news I had to deliver grew heavier with every step. When I finally reached my family, I tried to explain what happened, but the words kept getting stuck in my throat. Finally, I managed to tell them that Mark had drowned. Once I regained some composure, I led my father and uncle back through the woods to the pond. We searched the area, but there was still no sign of his body. We eventually had to go to the sheriff's office to report the incident officially. As we approached the station, I began to freak out. In my young mind, I was certain I would be blamed for the accident. The adults eventually calmed me down and assured me I wasn't in trouble, but the guilt remained. Every time I looked at my uncle, I felt responsible. Even though he told me he didn't blame me, I found it hard to believe he didn't hold some small resentment toward me for being the one who came home. I gave my statement to the sheriff. A formal search was scheduled for the following morning. As it turned out, that was the same day I was scheduled to return to my mother's house. On Monday night, my mother sat me down to give me an update. She told me that a team of divers had successfully recovered Mark's body earlier that day. They explained that one of his feet had become tangled in a sunken log, which was why he had been unable to resurface. Hearing the details didn't make the pain go away, but the tragedy changed the course of my life. The experience served as a powerful motivation for me to finally learn how to swim. The guilt of being unable to help stayed with me for decades, and I vowed never to be in a position where I was unable to assist someone in danger again. In a strange and painful way, his passing had a lasting impact on who I became, though I would still give anything to have him back with us today.
Illegal activities in the club. In a bustling American city, there was a lively place called Five Nights at Freddy's Club. It seemed like a fun and harmless spot for young people. The club had vibrant lights and music that attracted crowds looking to have a good time, dance, and make lasting memories. The atmosphere was filled with excitement as people embraced the carefree spirit of the night. However, hidden beneath the lively exterior, there was a secret side to Five Nights at Freddy's Club that the partygoers didn't know about. Behind the scenes, there were rumors of hidden activities that the revelers were unaware of. While the neon lights and energetic music created a lively atmosphere, there was a mysterious world behind it, keeping the patrons blissfully ignorant of the secrets hidden in the heart of Five Nights at Freddy's Club. One day, a reporter named Alex Thompson heard rumors about something bad happening at the club. People were saying that illegal drugs were being given to the partygoers without them knowing. Interested in uncovering the truth, Alex decided to go undercover to expose what was going on. Alex brought a hidden camera and a strong belief in doing what's right. Acting like any other person there to have a good time, Alex joined the lively crowd at the club. The place was full of energy, with bright lights and loud music making the dance floor come alive. As Alex moved through the crowded dance floor, it became clear that there was a challenge ahead. The club had tight security, with alert bouncers strategically placed to discourage unwanted attention. Despite this, Alex stayed determined, carefully watching the subtle interactions and whispered conversations among the partygoers. Weeks went by as Alex kept diving into the club scene, trying to collect proof to reveal the illegal drug trade. The nights started to blend, and frustration grew as every attempt to capture the illegal activities on camera failed. The drug deals were done secretly, and those involved were skilled at avoiding detection. But Alex didn't give up. Every obstacle only made Alex more determined to uncover the truth and shield the unsuspecting youth from the dangers hidden in Freddy's Club's shadow. One late night, as the music thumped to its peak, Alex had a breakthrough. In that club, there was a special room that only allowed rich and VIP guests. Security guards stood outside the room, making it impossible for an ordinary person to enter. For some reason, Alex found this strange and thought about listening to the activities and communication inside the room. However, the security was so tight that entering was completely impossible. Because of this, Alex came up with a plan. He decided to work as a waiter in the club to try to enter the room, but this plan failed because only appointed waiters were allowed inside. So, with the help of the club's gossip queen manager, Elizabeth, Alex thought of a way to get inside. After spending some time impressing Elizabeth, Alex finally got permission to be an appointed waiter. This way, he got the opportunity to enter the special room. The scene inside the room was quite surprising. Everyone there was discussing drugs and collaborating with the drug dealer. Alex recorded the whole incident with his mobile camera. Not only that, there was another incident in a corner. A group of people appeared to be involved in a suspicious transaction. Alex quietly approached, recording the exchange with the hidden camera. Finally, there was evidence. The footage showed young faces swapping small packages, exposing the unsettling truth beneath the surface of the lively celebration. Now that Alex had the evidence, it was time to reveal the story. Working hard to safeguard the identities of the innocent young people involved, Alex put together a powerful report. The report would expose the drug trade, while ensuring the anonymity of those unintentionally caught up in the deceit. But this journey was not so easy. Bringing the truth of the Five Nights at Freddy's Club to light was no walk in the park. When Alex tried to leave the club with the evidence, he was caught by the manager, Elizabeth, who had overheard the hidden conversation of the drug dealer. As a result, security guards were called, and Alex was taken into a room and beaten. However, Alex didn't lose courage. Somehow struggling with a security guard, he managed to escape from the room and, overcoming great difficulties, exited the club safely, saving himself from potential harm. As soon as he got outside, he took a deep breath and wasted no time. Alex immediately went to the police station. Once there, he showed the police all the evidence of the illegal activities happening in the club that he had captured on his camera. He also informed them about the assault he faced. Listening to his story and seeing the evidence, the police were quite surprised. They registered a First Information Report, FIR, based on his account and the evidence provided. When the story came out, it had a significant impact on the community. The revelation of drug activities in the beloved club caused shock, worry, and demands for quick action. Five Nights at Freddy's Club, once a symbol of youthful joy, was now tainted by the shadow of illegal activities. Because of public outrage and the growing evidence, the police acted quickly. They closed down the club and started legal proceedings against those involved in selling drugs. The shutdown of the club sent a strong message to other places that might be doing similar illegal activities. The city, now understanding the risks in seemingly harmless locations, started taking measures to keep its young people safe. The incident led to a wider discussion about the importance of having better security in clubs and being more careful to prevent illegal activities from getting into places meant for fun and friendship. Alex's courage in going undercover not only revealed the truth, but also brought about positive changes in the community. As the city recovered from the shock of Freddy's Club's hidden secret, its people promised to stay watchful, making sure that hidden dangers wouldn't endanger their youth again. After everything settled, Alex thought about how investigative journalism could reveal things that some wanted to keep in the dark. The story of Freddy's Club showed that, even amid celebration, there could be hidden problems, waiting to be uncovered by those willing to find the truth.
For reference, I am a 27-year-old female, and this story takes place 10 years ago when I was 17. I had just started university and was excited about having a fresh new start, since I'd always been a nerdy outcast in high school. I had never had a boyfriend before. I'd never even been on a date, so I was naive and optimistic about boys. My introverted and awkward personality hadn't magically changed since entering university, so it's safe to say that I didn't meet any interesting guys at school. One late night, I was in my room working on an assignment on my laptop when I received a request on MSN Messenger. The email address was a boy's name with some numbers. The name was clearly ethnic and likely someone of the same origin as mine. Intrigued, I accepted. For the sake of the story, we'll call the boy Ken. We got chatting, and I asked him how he had gotten my email address. He dodged the question. I let it go, not thinking too much into it. This was from a time when it was normal to accept anyone and everyone as a friend on Facebook, as well as other social media platforms. As Ken and I continued to talk, I learned that he lived in my city and, apparently, wasn't much older than me. As I guessed, our roots were, in fact, in the same country, the motherland. I asked him why he didn't have a picture of himself on his display picture, and this prompted him to suggest that we turn on our webcams because he wanted to see me too. I declined, but he insisted. Somehow, he convinced me, and we both switched on our webcams. I was pleasantly surprised and somewhat relieved to see that Ken was a good-looking young guy, chatting to me from the comfort of his bedroom, seemingly very normal. Our MSN chats carried on for a few weeks. They developed into texts, and we even had a few phone calls after I had agreed to give him my phone number. I started to develop a crush on Ken. He asked me to go out with him a few times, but I was always pretty busy with school, and our schedules weren't lining up. Finally, we found one afternoon when we were both free and decided to schedule a lunch date. Ken had a car and had offered to pick me up from my university after I was done for the day. I was a little too dressed up for my C++ programming class, but just right for the lunch date we had planned at the local vegetarian restaurant. Stupidly, I didn't tell any of my friends where I was going or with whom, because I was embarrassed about going on my very first date at almost age 18 with someone who had randomly added me on MSNA. I waited outside my building when a black car with heavily tinted windows pulled up beside me. The passenger side window rolled down, and sure enough, there was Ken sitting in the driver's seat. I was happy to see that he was just as cute in person as he was on webcam. However, what I wasn't expecting was the intense smell of weed floating out the car. Not relevant, but it is part of the first impression. Admittedly, I was a bit taken aback and was concerned that he might be driving high. He unlocked the doors and motioned for me to get in, so I did without dispute. As I sat down in the passenger seat, he started acting overly familiar in a way that made me uncomfortable. "So," I started, "do you know where the restaurant is? I can guide you if you want." He smirked at me, but didn't say anything and just started driving. Okay, kind of weird. I thought maybe I was just nervous or awkward, both of which I could sympathize with, so I let it be. I was about to try my hand at a little small talk, which I'm no good at, when I noticed him heading towards the highway ramp. I started to worry because the restaurant was not far from my campus, and there was no reason for us to be getting the highway. You don't need to get the highway. The restaurant's actually really nearby. I can guide you. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear my own nervousness. Ken finally spoke for the first time since I'd gotten in the car, suggested changing plans and going somewhere more private instead. "We can play Need for Speed, and I can make you lunch." I realized I was putting myself in a risky situation with someone I barely knew for the first time, and I hadn't told anyone where I was going. My mind was racing. I knew that this would be an utterly stupid thing to do, and despite the clear red flags waving in my face, I decided that I didn't want to ruin our first date by rejecting his offer to make me lunch and play Need for Speed together, which I told him I liked playing. Don't judge me. So, like an idiot, I reluctantly agreed to avoid being rude. We made it to his house. It was apparently his family's home, and was situated in a sort of shady neighborhood. We stepped inside, and of course, no one was home except us. It was sparsely furnished and looked unkept, which struck me as pretty odd for a family home. He informed me that his Xbox was in his bedroom. I hesitated in the doorway, but he sat at the foot of his bed in front of the TV and patted the empty space beside him for me to have a seat. There was literally nowhere else to sit in this room, so I cautiously sat down, keeping as much distance as I could between us. I started to relax as we played Need for Speed, and he made us peanut butter and jellies to munch on. I was about to laugh at myself for being overly paranoid when Ken did something bizarre. He got up onto the bed and sat uncomfortably close behind me, invading my personal space, an extremely awkward position, and tried to guide my hands on the controller. I started to ask him what he was doing, and as if this wasn't uncomfortable enough, his behavior suddenly crossed a clear personal boundary. That is when I really started to panic. I thought he was going to try and grope my chest, but instead he started squeezing, and he continued acting in a way that made me feel uneasy and unsafe. I was more than a little chubby back then. Freshman, and then some, so you can imagine what that might have been like. I dropped the controller in pure shock and quickly stood up, fixing my shirt. I was at a loss for words, and he did nothing but smirk at me until he reacted in a way that made the situation even more uncomfortable. I felt completely disgusted and violated. I'd had enough. I lied and told him that I had a group project to work on and needed to go. He asked where I lived so that he could drop me home. Thankfully, I had the common sense to not tell him and ask him to drop me back at school instead, where I would be supposedly meeting my classmates, and he obliged. After our very uncomfortable first date, I decided I didn't want to talk to Ken anymore. I didn't block him on MSN or my phone, our only two methods of communication, but I rarely responded to his messages, and I ignored all of his calls. Once he messaged me on MSN at around 11 p.m. asking me to come over and telling me that he would send a cab to bring me over to his place. Thoroughly annoyed, I responded. What do you take me for? Why do you even think I would want to go to that? He replied saying that it was nothing dirty and that he promised. It was just bizarre. I was disgusted and didn't even reply. He continued trying to get in touch with me for months and then suddenly vanished. I figured he'd finally gotten the point. Now, I wish this story ended here, but it doesn't. I last heard from Ken in late February. He had stopped trying to contact me shortly after Valentine's Day. In April, 2 nuclear family members and I went on a holiday to visit another relative called Annie, who was living in the Caribbean at the time. Annie, who I love dearly, was and still is a bit of an eccentric. She considers herself very spiritual and is an active member of a large, well-known spiritual organization. She is deeply connected with the motherland, more than the rest of us are, and goes back for frequent visits. While we stayed with her in the Caribbean, she told us about her most recent trip to the motherland, where she met a wealthy and well-connected local woman through the organization, who quickly became a very close friend. Connie, the con artist. During our visit, Anne introduced us to Connie virtually over Skype, because Connie lived in the motherland. We chatted to her a few times throughout our vacation by Skype, and got to know her a little bit. Little did we know back then that Connie, whom Annie had spontaneously met halfway across the world in the motherland, would soon wreak utter havoc on our lives. Now, that's a story that I'm just not ready to tell, and perhaps may never be, because of how many lives were affected, and the severity of the damage that had been inflicted. What you need to know is that Connie was an outright criminal and con artist who had been targeting our family from long before Annie had actually met her. Their meeting was no coincidence. Not only did she manage to steal over $100,000 from our family, but she took any peace of mind or sense of security we had with it. When we finally caught on and confronted her, she insisted that we were mistaken, but disappeared into thin air once we forced her out of our lives. You're probably wondering what on earth this has to do with the story about Ken. Well, get this. The situation with Connie lasted many months. The whole thing is kind of a blur to me now, but as we spoke to her online in April, I remember the whole ordeal lasting well into the fall. While she normally resided in the motherland, Annie had invited her to visit and stay with us, where we, my whole family and I, presently live. That's when things really took a turn for the worst. Some of the things I clearly remember, and are important to this story, were that one. The whole time she was staying with us, she was trying to convince me to transfer schools to a very obscure school and program in the US. I don't even live in the US and was actually getting very pushy about it. And 2, she had asked me very personal and inappropriate questions and made uncomfortable comments about my personal life and future. Disturbing, I know. During this time, I was so emotionally drained and stressed that I didn't really think of anything but the situation at hand. In fact, I had stopped socializing almost entirely, and even started habitually skipping classes. I had lost contact with my high school friends, and my university friends were too new to really care, so my strange behavior and new destructive habits went unnoticed. Fast forward one day after Connie's final disappearance in the fall. I was home with my dad when my cell phone rang. I looked at the caller ID, and it was a number I didn't have saved, so it was showing the contact information as whatever name the phone was registered under. My heart dropped to my stomach. My phone displayed a name. The first name was a man's name, and the last name was the same last name as Connie's. I began to panic, and I ran into my bedroom to answer the call. I had no idea what to expect, and when I answered the phone, I was greeted with a familiar voice. It was Ken. I honestly thought I was going to puke when I suddenly came to a realization that he had been a part of this whole sick plot. Of course, I don't have hard evidence to prove that he was connected to Connie, but let me explain. The timing of his appearance and reappearance into my life, the last name, a fairly unique surname originating from the part of the motherland where Connie is from, and I had never known Ken's last name until then. And the fact that he contacted me out of the blue, I had no idea why or how. It was all just too bizarre to be a mere coincidence. Of course, I freaked out at Ken when he called me, and I told him that if he ever called me again, I would call the police. His response was just a weird, dry half laugh, and then he said, "Well, okay then," in the most creepy voice you can think of, and hung up. I knew in my gut that that was their last attempt to get back in touch and somehow slither their way back into mine and my family's lives. Thankfully, I never heard from Ken again after that day. A while after all of this ended, I was having a conversation with a family member who was also closely involved in all of this, about the whole ordeal. And she told me she'd sensed something extremely wrong with Connie. She was pushing to have me sent off to the US to that obscure school, and she had an unshakable feeling that Connie was involved in some sort of trafficking scene, and that if I left, she would never see me again. The horrifying pieces came together, and I was just too damn naive to have seen it before. The memories flooded back to me when I heard that. How Ken told me, nothing dirty, I promise, when he invited me over, and how Connie was telling me to remain a virgin. As I said, I had never told a soul about Ken, nor about the weird V-card conversation with Connie. I strongly and firmly believe that Ken had been a sort of player in Connie's game, and was just there to keep me away from guys, and prevent me from having a boyfriend. For those of you wondering why we never called the police on Connie nor Ken, because nothing illegal ever happened at face value. It's a bit hard to explain. I'll also mention that I tried to find Ken online many times after everything ended. I don't know why. Perhaps I felt like I wanted to expose him, or call him out, and wasn't able to find a sliver of information on him. Not by the name Ken, nor by the name on the caller ID. It was as if he never existed. Also, from this incident onwards, I can't stomach a lot of these spiritual organizations. I never liked the idea to begin with, but now I've truly experienced how they can both attract the vulnerable and unsavory who are looking for someone vulnerable to prey on. No judgments to those who are into those sort of things. It just isn't for me personally. I would like to hear what you guys think of this. Do you think my suspicions are plausible? What do you make of Ken and Annie? And to you both, I hope you rot in hell.
I have reactive attachment disorder, and as a result, I struggle with severe depression. However, I don't take any medication. I say that because I was going through one of the worst bouts of depression I had suffered in a year and a half. And I wasn't hallucinating because of the medication. It was Tuesday night, or Wednesday morning, October 13th to 14th. I had cried myself to sleep like I had done for however many hours before. When I woke up, it was 3:34 a.m. My cat Betty was walking around on the bed, and for some reason, my alarm on my phone was going off. I used the Sleep Cycle app, and the alarm was going off even though I had set it for 5:30 to 6 a.m. So I am frustrated that it decided to stop working correctly. Then, I hear that my computer in the living room turns on. I thought that my other cat Vader must have knocked the mouse while wailing over the desk. Then I see the light turn on from the monitor. What? I thought. I was kind of pissed, so I started grumbling about the cats walking around, alarms going off unreasonably, and Vader knocking things about. Until I turned on the bedside lamp and saw both cats are lying at the end of my bed. Looking into my living room, I froze. I was so confused. I was trying to make sense of it when I heard my main door open. Like the screen door first, then the front doorknob. Then I heard someone move across the carpet. Unlike the movies, I jumped out of bed as quietly as possible, wondering how the hell was someone entering my apartment, as I sure as hell locked the front door to the apartment. I silently stepped into the hall and peeked around the corner. My cats nonchalantly decided to ignore the obvious home invader, thief, or murderer that had entered our home. I looked around the corner, and the door was closed. The lights were off, The monitor was off, but I could hear the computer running. I stood there frozen and listened for any noise for God knows how long. But I could not make sense of it at all and couldn't sleep the whole night. It wasn't a dream. Maybe I was sleepwalking. I don't know. But I have never been afraid of my apartment, and at that very moment, I felt very afraid. Very much alone. It hasn't happened again. Or maybe it has. I just don't know.
Growing up, the highlight of my life was the time spent fishing with my two older brothers. We lived in a remote rural area where the woods felt endless, and we would often spend our days hiking. Through the thick brush, we found various hidden creeks. Our success in terms of actual fish was usually minimal. The creeks rarely yielded anything of significant size. However, the catch was never the true point of the excursion. The real value lay in the silent camaraderie of sitting by the water with my brothers, passing the hours in the stillness of the trees. We followed the classic tradition of waking up long before the sun had risen. Our treks would begin in the cool, gray pre-dawn as we watched the light slowly steal across the sky and filter through the canopy. By the time we reached our chosen destination, the world would be fully bright. The morning dew would be clinging to our boots. It was a peaceful routine that defined our summers. The most frightening experience we ever had occurred on a day when we decided to be more adventurous than usual. We set out that morning with a collective determination to push further into the hills than we had ever gone before. We bypassed our familiar, reliable spots and kept walking until the woods grew denser and the air felt heavier. Eventually, we stumbled upon a location that seemed perfect. The surrounding forest was thick and ancient, but the creek itself was unexpectedly wide and deep. A large fallen tree stretched across the water like a natural bridge, adding to the beauty. After testing the trunk to ensure it was sturdy enough to hold our weight, the three of us carefully balanced our way across to the far bank. We spread out our gear and began to fish, hopeful for better luck. As the afternoon wore on, however, the fish remained elusive. The heat of the day began to set in, and the repetitive casting of lines grew tedious. Given how deep and inviting the water looked, we broke our usual rules. We set our fishing poles aside on the bank and jumped into the creek to go swimming. We had been splashing around for quite a while when I noticed a sudden shift in the atmosphere. My middle brother had stopped moving entirely and was staring intently into the dark tree line. When our oldest brother asked what was bothering him, he simply gestured toward the shadows of the woods. He whispered that someone was out there watching us from the cover of the trees. My initial thought was that we had encountered some local creep, but as I followed his pointing finger, that suspicion turned into sharp fear. Standing among the trees was an imposing large man. Despite the shade, we could make out his appearance quite clearly. He was dressed in jeans and a heavy flannel shirt, which seemed strangely out of place given the warmth. A baseball cap was pulled low over his brow, obscuring much of his face. The most terrifying detail, however, was the long firearm, either a rifle or a shotgun, that he held firmly in his hands. A heavy silence fell over us as we tried to decide what to do. We were well aware that by wandering this far, we were almost certainly trespassing. We never knew exactly where the property lines were. We knew this land didn't belong to us. Up until that moment, we had never faced any consequences for our wandering. My middle brother and I looked to our oldest brother for a plan, but he looked shaken. He offered no immediate direction, choosing instead to keep his eyes locked on the armed man. Eventually, our oldest brother suggested that we should try to navigate back to the bank, grab our gear and retreat. The problem was that our clothes and poles were on the same side of the creek where the man was standing. We began to move slowly through the water toward the shore, trying to remain calm, before we could reach the bank. However, an elderly woman suddenly burst from the undergrowth. She was shrieking with a high, piercing intensity that sounded like a banshee. The sudden noise startled me so badly that I slipped. I fell backward into the deep water, struggling until my middle brother grabbed my arm and pulled me back to the surface. The woman was disheveled and frantic as she ran straight for our pile of belongings. She began grabbing our fishing poles and clothes, clutching them to her chest while shouting that everything now belonged to her. She gathered the items in a desperate heap, dropping small pieces of gear as she managed the armful. Our oldest brother shouted for her to stop and tried to move faster toward the shore to reclaim our property. However, our middle brother reached out and stopped him, pointing back toward the large man in the flannel shirt. The man had moved closer to the water's edge as we approached the shore. He raised his gun and leveled it in our direction as he walked. I remember yelling out in terror while my middle brother apologized. He told them we were sorry for trespassing on their land. The pair ignored our pleas entirely. Our oldest brother, driven by a mix of frustration and bravado, muttered that he didn't think the man would actually shoot. He tried to take another step toward the woman to get our shoes and shirts back. The moment he moved, the woman's demeanor shifted from frantic to aggressive. She pulled a fillet knife from her pocket. She began waving it wildly at him, screaming that she would cut him if he came any closer. By this point, the large man had reached the very edge of the creek. He cocked the shotgun with a heavy mechanical click and pointed it directly at my oldest brother's chest. That sound was enough to make him freeze instantly in his tracks. It was a terrifying, tense standoff. We stood chest deep in the cold water, shivering as we stared down the barrel of a gun. Once the woman had finished scavenging every bit of our gear and clothing, the man spoke a single, gravelly word. He told us to get out. We didn't wait for a second invitation. All three of us turned and swam desperately for the opposite bank. We scrambled out of the water and began running into the woods. The journey home was miserable. We had to hike several miles through the dense forest wearing nothing but our soaking wet shorts. We were completely barefoot, and every twig, sharp rock, and dried leaf stung our feet. Despite the pain, we were far too frightened to even think about looking back or slowing down. When we finally made it home and explained why we had returned empty-handed, our father surprisingly didn't scold us. He simply told us that there are dangerous, unstable people living deep in the woods, and that we had to be more careful. It was a very long time before any of us felt brave again.
It is a chilling realization to look back at an evening and see exactly where the warning signs were ignored. A few months ago, a date began with a nagging sense of familiarity that could not be placed. The assumption was that the encounter had happened on a random night out, and because it was a last-minute arrangement, the expectations were kept low. A clear boundary was set early on. There was no desire for a serious relationship, only a casual hangout. In hindsight, that was the first mistake in a series of events that quickly spiraled into a nightmare. The man seemed decent enough at first, but his demeanor shifted the moment they arrived at the restaurant. While he declined to order food, he immediately began making forward comments about her body and curves. Though she tried to laugh it off to ease the tension, his bluntness felt inappropriate and aggressive. As she ate, the conversation took a turn toward the nice guy trope. He lamented about how other women never gave men like him a chance, which sent immediate red flags through her mind. Sensing danger, she fabricated a story about needing to head home early to dog sit for her parents. He appeared to believe the excuse, but his behavior only grew more predatory. He spent the meal staring at her chest and pressured her for suggestive photos. When she expressed her discomfort and told him she didn't engage in that behavior, he briefly stopped, only to produce a strange set of gifts from his bag. He presented a bouquet of roses and, inexplicably, a bag of prawns from Tesco. Her confusion turned to genuine fear when he explained the gift. He claimed to know she loved prawns and tempura. The problem was that she had never mentioned her food preferences to him. The urge to run was overwhelming, yet the social pressure not to be rude kept her in her seat for the remaining hour. As the clock ticked down, he began reciting intimate details of her life, with terrifying accuracy. He knew which school she had attended, her personality traits as a child, and her current professional situation. When she finally demanded to know how he possessed this information, he revealed a disturbing level of premeditation. His mother had been one of her former teachers, and he had interrogated her for details while scouring the internet for anything else he could find. A timely text from her mother provided a temporary lifeline. She used the notification as an excuse to end the date, claiming her parents had mixed up the schedule and she needed to leave immediately. The man accepted this, but insisted on walking her home. She attempted to compromise by suggesting he only walk her halfway, as she wasn't comfortable revealing her address. It was then that he dropped another bombshell. He already knew which road she lived on, though he claimed not to know the specific house number. When she called out how creepy and weird his knowledge was, he lied and claimed she had told him herself. For her own safety, she tried to steer them toward a well-lit main road, but he grabbed her hand and forced her toward a dark shortcut. Despite her protests, he dragged her onto a deserted street. In the shadows, he suddenly forced himself on her, shoving his tongue down her throat. She managed to push him away, and the sight of a distant stranger walking a dog provided enough of a distraction for her to bolt back toward the main road. Even then, he refused to leave. He continued to follow her until she stopped and tried to bid him a final polite farewell, mentioning it was nice to meet him again. At that point, the truth of their familiarity came out. He admitted they had never actually met before. He had simply lied about a previous encounter to trick her into meeting him. As she tried to walk away, he grabbed her again, pulling her towards some bushes while claiming there was one more thing he needed to do. The physical struggle intensified as he tightened his grip, his fingers digging into the soft skin of her arm with a strength that made her breath hitch. She tried to twist away, but he used his body weight to pin her closer to the rustling leaves of the overgrown hedge, the rough branches catching in her hair. Every time she tried to speak, he leaned in further, his shadow completely engulfing her as he ignored her repeated pleas to be left alone. The air felt heavy and cold as she realized he wasn't just being pushy. He was actively trying to overpower her in the dark, secluded space. She felt a wave of nausea hit as he whispered about how it would only take a moment, his eyes darting around to ensure they were still hidden from the streetlights. The situation turned violent as he squeezed her wrist hard enough to cause pain, pulling her back for another forced kiss. He explicitly suggested they use the bushes for privacy, and though she screamed no and fought back, he continued to drag her toward the brush, promising it would only take a second. It was only the appearance of more dog walkers that caused him to hesitate. He took one last opportunity to assault her by grabbing her breast before she finally broke free and ran. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she fled, terrified that he was right behind her. She took a long, circuitous route home to ensure she wasn't being followed. Once inside the safety of her house, she collapsed into tears. The horror reached its peak when a message arrived on her phone from a different account. It was him describing the evening as the best date ever and calling her the prettiest girl he'd ever kissed. He signed off by calling himself a gentleman and mentioning that he was currently standing on her road. She sank to the floor, paralyzed by the realization of her proximity to him. Looking closer at his profile, the memory finally clicked. Years earlier, this same man had plagued her old Facebook account with disturbing messages and creepy, edited photos, professing his love. The entire terrifying ordeal, from the first greeting to the final threat, had lasted only 90 minutes, but the impact would last much longer.
Back when I was a teenager, me and my brother were absolutely obsessed with fishing. We still enjoy the occasional trip all these years later. Don't get me wrong, but back then we lived and breathed river fishing. So much so that we used to participate in fishing tournaments and therefore had to take part in training sessions every other day. Spoilers, but these training sessions were just an excuse to get some time in by the river, and I won't bore you with how the fishing tournaments work. So just take our word that we fished an awful lot. Anyway, I was like 13 years old. It was September, and me and my brother were fishing down at this river bend out in the sticks. Now, you gotta keep in mind that in river and lake fishing, you gotta be quiet as a mouse unless you scare the fish away. So as the skies darkened, this low rumbling of thunder echoed around the sky. Well, you can imagine how creepy that was. We're expecting rain, but that doesn't mean we're going to stop fishing. And it has to take much more than that to scare us off. And cue the appearance of some creepy stranger who walks out of the woods on the other side of the river. He doesn't have any gear with him besides the rod, but he's got a fishing hat on one that has all his scraggly gray hair tumbling out from under it. We try to wave hi, but he just gives us this look as if to say, "You're in my spot." And me and my brother are getting ready to pack up if he asks us, because God knows people can get really territorial about their favorite spot being crept on. But the guy doesn't say anything, and he just walks about 100 yards upstream and starts fishing up there. All right, he was kind of choking off our spot. But we were never ones to back away from a challenge, so we stayed put. As we're fishing, the thunder and lightning get louder and louder, and the gaps between them shorter and shorter, meaning it's slowly traveling right above our heads. I end up looking upstream to see if the grumpy old dude is still there, and he is. But then I notice how his rod is bending and doesn't sit right with me. It looks nice and strong, but way too flexible to be anything other than carbon fiber. At least, that was my guess. But here's the thing. Although you don't think of carbon fiber as being metal, it's super conductive to electricity. Meaning, if this guy really was using a carbon fiber rod, it wasn't so much a fishing rod as a lightning rod. I remember whispering to my brother, like, "Think that guy's using carbon fiber?" To which he replies, "He's old. Is that Tom? Look at the way the thing's been, though," I remember saying. My brother looks again, and that's when he sees what I'm seeing. And then out of nowhere, this huge crack and flash let us know that we've just been within 100 yards of a lightning strike that impacted really close to our grumpy fishing guy. We get up and just hightail it over to where he was standing, and there's this guy's rod laying there in the dirt smoking. We started looking around for the guy to see if he was okay, but we couldn't find anything. Not a single trace of this dude. But then my brother finds one of the guy's boots lying near the root of the tree that's smoking too. And that's when he looks up. We finally find where the guy went. The lightning had blown this poor sob right up into a tree. We bailed to the nearest gas station to call the EMTs, but by that time, the guy was long dead, and there was no saving him. This was a long time ago, and a memory that stuck with me for a long time, and it was truly very hard to get back into fishing after that. But of all the freaky occurrences that kind of came out of that, the one thing that really stuck with me was the smell in the air when we finally found him. It honestly smelled like barbecue pork. About 8 years ago now, me and my dad and a few of my cousins were fishing down in southern Maryland one summer. We were out at the particular spot where there are these things called target ships. These are old decommissioned Navy ships that have been mounted on top of concrete pillars so they can float no matter how much the Navy tests munitions on them. They get shot at by all kinds of vehicles with all kinds of bullets, bombs, and missiles. But anyway, we're all on my dad's Grady White fishing for croaker and flounder right near these target ships. If they're actually being used for military exercises, you can't even get near them. So since there's no one out there to wave us away, we were out near the target ships with about 20 other boats in the water. But then, sure enough, about an hour and some guy from the Coast Guard sails up to us. They're on a big old CG boat with about 15 trainees on board, and the officer in command asks a favor from my dad. He wants to know if he can practice a little inspection drill with a few of his trainees. Being the good guy he is, my dad gives them permission, then renders them coming on board. I feel my rod getting all heavy all of a sudden. I call it out, and the Coast Guard officer stops his inspection and says, "Go ahead, son, reel it up. Let's see what you got." So I reel and reel, and it's really obvious how heavy whatever I've caught is. So naturally, we're all getting mad excited. Then, to all of our absolute horror, I pull the thing from the water, and we all see that it is an unexploded bomb. It was a cylindrical diamond shape with neon green stabilizers, about 12 to 14 inches long and 4 inches in diameter at its thickest part. Well, now the officer, the trainee, and the entire boat of Coast Guard has just witnessed what I pulled out of the water. And I'm not kidding when I say that. I watched the color drain from all their faces. They went from pink, unhealthy, to skeletal white. And the time it took to say the trainee on our boat literally leaves to his boat, and they all haul it away with their sirens on. This leaves a very rattled Coast Guard officer on our boat, who promptly orders me to not move a single muscle. The Coast Guard gets on our VHF and tells all the boats in the area to leave the target ships. And I'm telling you, you ain't never seen fishing boats move so fast. After about 20 minutes of me sitting there with this bomb on my line, the area is finally cleared away. The officer orders my father to put his boat and drive to achieve a good bit of speed, and then don't stop. So my dad goes as he's ordered, puts the boat in gear, and seconds, we're rolling about 50 to 20 knots away from the ship. The absurd brings out a knife, cuts my line, and orders my dad to just throttle the boat and get away as fast as you can. Needless to say, it did not detonate when it hit the bottom of the bay. We took the officer, who was pretty clearly shaken, back to his ship. I know it's hard to believe the story without proof, but in the situation, we didn't have time to get a picture of it. We tried, but the Coast Guard officer was adamant about us getting out of there as quickly as possible. But take my word for it, it's easily the scariest thing I've ever had happen to me during a fishing trip.
In the summer of 2006, I was offered a place to study history at Bangor University in North Wales. It wasn't my first choice of uni, but I always wanted to move away for university. I mean, that's half the point of the whole thing, isn't it? See, new places meet new people, expand and enrich your intellect and all that. Bangor wasn't exactly Manchester or Birmingham, but there was something very quaint about having such a relatively prestigious university built into such a small and storied town. In the end, I only lived in Bangor for the better part of a year, as I ended up dropping out due to family problems. But my brief time there yielded a variety of different experiences. Some I'll always remember, and some I wish I could forget. So much like most other students at that age, university bred a desire for, well, experimentation. And as I partook in a few puffs of the wise man's mint, as one of my mates called it, and decided that, yeah, it was something I was going to get into. I didn't take the drinking all that much, too much puking, and the hangovers just weren't worth it. But smoking up in a circle packed with intelligent, thoughtful people, that was a different kettle of fish entirely. Alright, most of the stuff we talked about was just absolute nonsense, which prompted nothing but a descent into giggles. But it was fun. And on top of that, you weren't a soulless, dehydrated husk the next morning. So one morning, I get talking to this local lad called Ricky. Ricky had grown up in Bangor, but wasn't academic enough for university. However, that didn't stop him from walking up into the student areas to take advantage of the public price pubs, which is how I got to talking to him. Eventually, the conversation got on to smoke and where I could get my hands on some, but local dealers didn't always trust the students, and even when they did, the chances that they just rip you off, assuming you were spending mommy and daddy's money, was very high indeed, which is why Ricky's promise of "I'll get some for you" was like music to my ears. I took his number down, told him I'd give him the text sometime, then finished up my pint, lost my game of pool, then wandered back to Halls. The next day, I gave Ricky a text, and we arranged to meet outside a block of flats on the other side of town. This seemed a bit risky, as it was in the lower portion of Bangor, where the locals lived, and not up on the hill where most of the lecture rooms and halls were. But Ricky seemed like a nice enough bloke. I considered myself fairly streetwise, and with me having no other connections, I figured, why not? So I went to meet him, gave him my last 20 quid, and stood outside the flats and we went out to ring one of the buzzers. Now,
I'm not completely soft, so I actually ended up peering over my shoulder to get a peek of which one he's ringing, just in case anything goes awry. The door opens. He says, "Back in a minute," and walks inside. A minute goes by. No sign of Rookie. 2 minutes go by. Still no sign of Ricky. After 15 minutes of standing outside those flats like an absolute plant pot, I tried calling him. But as you can probably guess, he didn't answer his phone. I dropped him a few texts like WTF is going on in here? And again, I get no replies. Obviously, I'm absolutely furious thinking, I can't believe I'm actually getting mugged off here. And there's absolutely no effing chance that I'm about to just walk away without kicking off. So I marched up to the little keypad near the front door of the flats and started buzzing the same button Ricky pushed. "Hello?" Some voice buzzes over the intercom. "Yeah, I'm a mate of Ricky's. He's got something that's mine. He needs to get back." Oh, the fellow on the other end was obviously playing dumb. "Look, mate, I've just seen him go into your flat, so you can either let me in or I'll come back later with my cousins and we can see what happens." It was a pure bluff. My cousins were like 60 miles away, but it worked. There was a brief silence, and then the door buzzed open. I walked right up the stairs to flat 3, knock on the door, and someone instantly answers it aloud about my age, who's keeping the door closed over because Ricky is evidently hiding inside. "Mate, I know Ricky is here, and he's got something in mind." "So he was here, yeah," the lad cuts me off, "but he's just gone off the back. Said he'll be back in a few minutes." Then I hear a voice that obviously belongs to someone older, saying, "Let him wait inside if he wants." The lad looks off to the right, then opens up the door. I walk in to see about 3 or 4 guys, again about my age, and one older balding bloke are down to his shoulders with this big, thick stash. In front of him on this dirty wooden coffee table, almost every kind of illegal substance you can imagine. And after waiting there for about 15 minutes, tension rising the whole time, I decided to give them something of an ultimatum. Because there's absolutely no doubt that I am getting scammed, and they just so happened to be in on it. Now, I know, what I did next was just stupid. But please don't underestimate how angry I was, and how I just refused to swallow my pride and walk away. So we turned to the old bloke and say something like, "Look man, let's just work this out. Ricky got 20 quid of mine, and I'm not stupid. I know what the crack is. I'm also not walking away without it. So let's just say you give me 1/8 of that green there, and that way, I don't have to file a police report saying some lad robbed me and ran into this flat. You get me?" Big mistake. Massive mistake. Sometimes, it really is just better to swallow your pride and walk away, especially if the only other option is throwing around threats that you're unlikely to back up. But in the heat of the moment, that's kind of what I did. And by kind of, Mo, you'll see what I mean in a minute. Until hearing my police threat, the older bloke just sort of nods his up to say fair shout and gets up and walks over to the front door. I'm thinking, hang on, what's he doing? And when he locks the front door to the flat with a mortised lock and slides the key into his pocket, I just think, oh, you can imagine what came next. The 3 younger lads jumped me. I tried my best to fight back, but as you can probably guess, 3-on-1 didn't give me a chance to throw, so much as 2 or 3 solid punches. Before I was on the deck getting the absolute life kicked out of me, all to a soundtrack of you coming to my flat and threatening me. Not happening. But the worst part was when I just heard, grab his hand, kept them still. I'm still in the middle of struggling, but I managed to get just a glimpse of the old bloke with a dumbbell in his hand might know what's coming. This fellow is going to smash my hand to bits without weight, and I'm probably never going to be able to write or type properly again. Thankfully,
he didn't go through a smash in my hand up. Instead, he does this faint thing right as I think he's going to do it, then laughs his head off when I let out this embarrassingly girly scream. After that, I'm quite literally thrown out of the flat, and as I manage to bring myself to my feet and look back to see that one of the lads has my bloody provisional driver's license in hand. The wallet must have fallen out of the swipe during the kicking. Ah well, now we know your name and where you live. Go the filth and you're a dead man. Get lost. I wandered. But the story doesn't end there. It just gets much weirder and arguably more terrifying. If I'd have just walked away with a bit of a bruised ego, I'd have saved myself a good kicking. However, in actually laying hands on me, these lads had made a huge mistake. I wasn't some gangster bound to a code of silence and honesty. Neither were they. I was a big city, and I definitely wasn't scared of some small town dealers. And if they thought they could just intimidate some kid into silence, that were dead wrong. Because the first place I go, after I ended up getting kicked out of the Phyllis flat, is the Bangor police station. I was just dead honest with them. I told them I got scammed trying to buy smoke. Told the man being battered with me thinking the whole time. They're going to go round up this bloke's flat, and they're going to know he's got drugs in there. The place stunk of them, and that's how I'm going to get my own back. Solid plan, right? And quick side note, for anyone who says I'm a coward, a grass, or a snitch for going to the police, wind your neck in Tony, Montana. This isn't The Wire. This is real life, and you fight with anything you've got available to you. Only, it didn't quite turn out like that. I was hoping the police would knock round Nick the bloke and his underlings, and then I'd see massive drug busts in the papers for a week or something like that. But when the police got back in touch, they said they'd nick a lad for assaulting me, but he was going to plead guilty, so it didn't look like I'd have to go to court or anything. They gave me some leaflets on getting over trauma, advised me to file victims of crime compensation claim, and then that was that. Yeah, it was some small measure of revenge, but it wasn't quite the complete and utter takedown I'd been hoping for. That being said, it would turn out that I didn't have to lift a finger to get my own back on Ricky. His own people would do that for me. Not even 7 days later, I'm doing a bit of food shopping down at Morson's, when who should I see? The giant cast on his leg and bruises all over his face. But Ricky, of all people, almost everyone I spoke to about it was like, wow, that's some karma in action right there. And they might still be right. It might have been a complete coincidence that 1 week the lad robs me, and the next he's in a bloody thigh cast, which how I know it must have been a really bad break. Stranger things have happened, right? But there's a thing. I don't really believe in coincidences. I believe in cause and effect. I think the top dog down in the lower town flat was just that top dog in the area. And I think the trouble Ricky ended up causing him Monday was only a fanny hair away from being nicked for selling Class A's. I think he was so angry that he had his little minions break Ricky's leg. I mean, how else to explain his black eyes and all that? He slipped and fell on the path of an oncoming fun run, pulled the other one. But then, the thing that really tickled me, the thing that honestly made my blood run cold, was this. If they were willing to do that to one of their own, they wouldn't bat an eyelid at the idea of doing the same to some other idiot student, would they? And it's only then that I realized how bloody lucky I'd really been. A few months after I completely balls up my end-of-year exams, ended up dropping out, and that was the end of that chapter. Needless to say, despite the relatively short amount of time I'd spent there, Bangor really did teach me a thing or two. They just turned out not quite to be the kind of things I imagined when I arrived.
In early 2019, as a 16-year-old living in the UK, I agreed to a semi-blind date with a 19-year-old named Cameron. We had been introduced through a mutual friend and had seen photos of one another beforehand. To all outward appearances, Cameron seemed like a perfectly ordinary person. He enjoyed video games and anime, and nothing in his background suggested anything unusual or alarming. After exchanging numbers and texting for a single evening, we decided to meet the following day at a local Starbucks. Although I typically prefer to wait longer before meeting someone in person, I felt a sense of security, knowing we shared a trusted friend. I arrived at the coffee shop slightly ahead of schedule. Following my usual habit of buying my own drink, to avoid any sense of obligation, I ordered a coffee and found a seat facing away from the entrance. I spent about 15 minutes relaxing with a book until a text arrived from Cameron announcing his arrival. I messaged him back to indicate which table I was sitting at. Almost immediately, I felt someone standing directly behind me. As I began to turn my head to acknowledge him, he suddenly pressed his lips against my neck and began to suck on my skin before I could even utter a greeting. The gesture was incredibly invasive. I have always been deeply uncomfortable with anyone touching my neck due to being extremely ticklish. Even professional massages or hair treatments feel like an ordeal to me. To make matters worse, he had a heavy, unpleasant scent that reminded me of old dust. Startled and overwhelmed, I instinctively elbowed him in the chest to force him away. When he finally let go, he stared at me with an unsettling expression and gave a flat, deadpan laugh. The situation felt increasingly eerie. When I demanded an explanation for his behavior, he simply brushed it off by claiming he thought the gesture was cute. Despite my rising alarm, I tried to convince myself that first impressions could be misleading and that I should still attempt to have a conversation. However, he spent the duration of our talk staring inappropriately at my chest. He made a crude, direct comment, expressing surprise at my physical appearance based on my ethnicity, and stated his intention to keep me around. At that point, my discomfort turned into genuine fear. The vibes he was giving off were so predatory that I didn't feel safe simply standing up and walking out the front door. I retreated to the ladies' bathroom and waited for another woman to enter. Once someone arrived, I explained my situation and asked if she could help me leave without being spotted, as I was terrified he might try to follow me home. The woman was incredibly kind and agreed to help, even lending me her hat and scarf to mask my appearance. Under the cover of the winter accessories and the crowded room, we walked out together. She successfully helped me slip out through the Starbucks back exit without him noticing my departure. Afterward, he reached out to our mutual friend to ask where I had gone, but I instructed my friend never to mention me to him again. While I sometimes feel guilty for not ending the date more formally, the fear I felt in that moment was overwhelming. It was a disturbing experience that I hope never to repeat.
In the fall of 2019, my friends and I went on a 3-day camping trip in the desert. Our plan was to hike, explore, and do some shooting in a safe, remote area. There was 7 of us in total. 3 of us, myself and my 2 friends, who we'll call A and E, were emergency medical professionals. We established our camp near the road by an embankment that served as a good backstop for a shooting range. The first day and night passed without incident. I do recall, however, watching a truck with a large trailer drive by slowly as the sun set. This normally wouldn't have caught my attention, but the cargo, though covered, didn't resemble camping gear, and the truck's bed was empty. The 2 men inside the truck and I made eye contact as they passed. I offered a friendly smile and a wave, but they just stared back, motionless. After a moment, they both looked away and sped off, their trailer rumbling behind them. I didn't think much of it and continued with my night. Our second day was filled with more hiking and shooting. We stopped around dusk so the loud gunfire wouldn't disturb any other campers nearby. As night fell, we built a bonfire, opened some beers, and talked for a while. During our conversation, I noticed a faint reddish glow dip behind a nearby hill before vanishing. I asked the group if anyone else had seen it, but no one had. I dismissed it, thinking I had mistaken a fire ember for something else. About 10 minutes later, I saw the light again, this time higher in the sky and deeper in the desert. One of my friends identified it as a flare. I suggested that it might be an emergency flare. We agreed that if we saw another one, some of us would go investigate, since we had brought advanced medical supplies with us. Sure enough, a few minutes later, another flare appeared, a little to the west of the last one. A plan was quickly formed. A and E called another friend J, and I would take his truck to find whoever might need help. We were aware that cartels had previously used parts of this desert as hidden transport routes, so we brought some of our firearms for protection. We loaded our medical gear, got into the truck, and started driving, leaving the others behind to watch the camp. We headed toward the last flare, with the windows rolled down, listening for any calls for help. We also announced our presence, hoping anyone in distress would call out to us. As we continued, another flare shot up further west, casting a dim red light on the rocky hills. I pointed out the direction, and we found a small, dry ravine to use as a path. We drove down the dark ravine for some time, with only the truck's headlights cutting through the imposing blackness. We kept calling out, but heard nothing back. Another flare went up nearby, but still we could see no one. We drove until the ravine ended in a natural cul-de-sac, surrounded on three sides by rocky hills. We got out and searched the area with our flashlights, yelling out again, but there was no response. The place was empty, though we were certain this was where the flare had come from. After a thorough search, we decided to check another area back on the main road. The end of the ravine was a tight spot for the truck, but I managed to make a U-turn. Jay and I rode in the truck bed on the way out to get a better vantage point. As we turned, a cloud of dust and gravel hit me, accompanied by a loud hissing sound. I yelled out, wondering what had happened. I told him I thought he had blown a tire. We got out to inspect and found that his rear passenger side tire was flat. I noticed something strange about it. The tear was a clean cut on the sidewall, not jagged on the bottom as you'd expect from a sharp rock. I mentioned how suspicious this seemed, but my friends figured it must have just been a particularly sharp stone. While they worked on replacing the tire with the spare, I stood watch. The task was difficult. The tire iron bent, as did one of the lug nuts. As they struggled with it, I heard a sound approaching me quickly from the darkness. I instinctively turned, drew my pistol, and aimed my flashlight toward the noise. A large rock had rolled down one of the hills and stopped about 10 feet away from me. I scanned the top of the hill with my light, but saw nothing. Only a few small rocks and some gravel still tumbling down. I almost laughed at my overreaction, but then another large rock started rolling down toward me from the same area. Paranoia began to set in. Those rocks seemed too large to have been moved by any animal, and they had both come from the same spot. I told my friends what was happening, but they brushed it off, saying I was getting paranoid. I conceded it was possible, but I kept my guard up. My gut told me something was wrong, and I started to think the flares might be a trap. Despite the trouble, we were cracking jokes about our luck. I remarked that even though the situation was bad, he was glad to be in it with us, and we all felt the same. Just as they finished replacing the tire, another flare shot up into the sky near the entrance of the ravine and fell back to earth close by. We called out one last time as we loaded back into the truck, but were again met with silence. We drove back to the main trail, seeing no one. We started to doubt that anyone was in trouble and began to suspect it was just some kids illegally playing with a flare gun. Still, we weren't ready to give up. We started driving deeper into the desert when another flare was spotted. This one puzzled us. All the previous flares had been in roughly the same area, but this one was far to the northwest. I wondered aloud how they could have moved so far. E commented that if it was irresponsible teenagers, they needed to be told not to cause such a panic. We pressed on toward the last light, which led us to an even more confusing scene. We arrived at a dark campsite nestled between two hills. Our headlights revealed 2 tents, scattered belongings, and a fire pit. Something felt wrong. The camp looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. The tents were unoccupied, but still full of gear, and the fire had been stomped out, its coals just barely glowing. They had left everything behind: equipment, shoes, and packs. As I searched, I found something more unsettling: recently fired 12-gauge shotgun shells. They were clean with no dust on them, and still smelled of gunpowder. I showed my friends, and they agreed this was very strange. We then found deep tire tracks, suggesting someone had left in a great hurry. That's when I saw it, an ominous orange glow coming from over the North Hill that overlooked the campsite. I asked E to come with me to check it out. As we climbed the hill, we heard a low noise that grew steadily louder. When we reached the top, we looked down into a barren valley. About 50 yards away was a large circle of dark, hooded figures in robes. Their arms were stretched to their sides, and they were all vocalizing in a low chant. In the center of the circle was a wide ring of fire, and inside the flames, a massive black pyramid frame was visible. A short distance away, I saw the same truck and trailer from the day before, parked with other vehicles. I told her that I thought it was a cult. As the words left my mouth, the chanting stopped. The group of what must have been 50 people all turned toward us in silence. It was then I realized I had left my flashlight on. They all raised their arms once more and let out a horrifyingly loud wail. It started with one voice, then others joined in until the sound was overwhelming. I told in an anxious whisper that we had to get out of there immediately. We turned and ran down the hill. He yelled for A and J to start the truck. A and J looked at us with confused amusement, but I explained breathlessly that we had found a cult and that they knew we were there. Seeing the genuine fear on our faces, that ushered us into the truck, and we sped back toward our camp. As we got onto the main road, something happened that made A and J fully believe us and confirmed my suspicions about the flares. From every hill along the road, on all sides, flares shot up into the sky, illuminating the desert around us in what felt like either a warning or a threat. As we drove, more and more flares flew up, filling the sky until we were far enough away that they faded behind us. We made it back to our camp and explained everything to the others. They seemed as if they didn't fully believe our story, but they knew we wouldn't make something like that up. We spent the night speculating that the flares were either a lure or a warning system for the cult. We slept close together with our firearms nearby. The next morning, as we were cleaning up, I was clearing debris from our shooting range when I found something that hadn't been there before. A small wooden pyramid frame, charred black and still smoldering. I called everyone's attention to it, and we promptly packed up and left. We returned to our normal lives, but I think back to that event every now and then. I'm thankful that my friends and I were not harmed, and I hope the owners of that abandoned campsite managed to escape safely. I have no idea what that group was, or who those people were. I don't know if they were a legitimate cult or just people trying to prank campers. I'm fortunate I haven't had any other encounters like this, but I now know for certain that there are some strange people out in that desert.
This event took place in the early 2000s, when my husband was frequently away, traveling for a major insurance company. Because of his work, our young daughter and I spent the majority of our days alone. A few years prior, we had bought a house on a somewhat isolated piece of land. The trip between town and home could often be difficult, especially during heavy rain. The last 5 miles of the road to our house was narrow, and consisted of nothing more than loose gravel. My daughter and I found ourselves stranded on this section of road on a particularly bad night. I tried my best to keep our old Subaru on the road, but the rain made visibility almost impossible. It wasn't long before I misjudged a curve and ended up in the ditch. Fortunately, my husband had the foresight to sign us up for a roadside assistance program. I contacted them and was informed that the bad weather was keeping them busy, but they assured me they would get to us as soon as they could. Unsure how long we would be stuck, I made my daughter as comfortable as possible, and we waited. The rain soon stopped, allowing me to see how far we were from home. I estimated the house was about 2.5 miles away, and considered walking, but I remembered no one was home to retrieve the car later. Help was on its way, so I decided to remain where we were. Within 10 minutes of the accident, I saw approaching headlights and began to feel hopeful. However, the vehicle was not a tow truck. Instead, it was an older man driving a rusty pickup. When he saw our car, he slowed down and looked inside as he drove past. I initially thought he was going to offer to pull us out, but he continued down the road. I didn't dwell on it at the time, but 5 minutes later, the rusty truck approached us again, coming from the opposite direction at a very slow speed. He stared at me once more as he passed, making brief eye contact, but he didn't stop. Things began to seem strange, but I considered that perhaps he was lost and was merely turning around to return to the highway. I reminded myself that he wasn't obligated to help, and maybe he thought I was simply parked instead of stuck. I thought he probably wasn't from the area and was just trying to get home like I was. The situation didn't start to feel truly scary until I noticed the same truck approaching for a third time. It was now completely dark, and like most women, I felt much less safe after sunset, which made the circumstances even more unsettling. He performed his now familiar slow drive. This time, however, he stopped the truck after passing and quickly executed a 3-point turn. He was now facing us again, stopped about 10 yards away. Instead of getting out to offer assistance, he remained in his cab and watched for a few minutes. It was only then that he opened the door and began to step out of the truck. Almost as soon as his foot touched the pavement, a pair of headlights appeared from the other direction. The man stayed where he was, watching and waiting for a minute until the approaching vehicle was close enough to reveal itself as a tow truck. Once he saw this, he immediately jumped back into his cab, made a quick U-turn, and sped away from us. My heart pounded as I watched this scene unfold, and I was unable to relax until I could read the name of the company on the side of the tow truck. The tow truck driver wasted no time, pulling his truck in front of us and hooking up to my car. I was finally confident he was there to help, and I thank him. He had us out of the ditch in a matter of minutes, and we were back on the road. For the rest of the journey, I vigilantly searched for the rusty truck. Even as I drove up our own driveway, I was afraid I would see him lying in wait. Thankfully, he was not there, and I got my daughter safely into the house for the night. When my husband returned from his latest trip, I recounted the events of the storm, but I deliberately omitted the part involving the strange truck. I knew that sharing it would only cause him more stress while he was away, and at the time he had no alternative but to continue his trips. After the recent trouble, he went out and purchased a nearly new 4-wheel drive Jeep for me. I was thrilled to get it and never got stuck again, even on the muddy sections of our property. It didn't take long for the memory of the stranger in the rusty truck to fade from my mind. However, for the next 2 weeks, I would catch myself searching for it anytime I drove on that stretch of road. I had almost completely forgotten about the incident until very recently, when I saw a similar truck at the store. It was not the same one, of course, but it caused the entire memory to come flooding back and motivated me to write this story. Fortunately, in the years since then, the county has paved and widened the roads, and my wonderful husband now gets to come home to us every night.